Would I be right in saying that under process metaphysics, there are no things?
So there are various forms of process metaphysics. The purest or more radical one perhaps would go as far as to say that there are no things in the world. But there are different ways of interpreting process ontology. One can simply say that one regards process as being prior or more fundamental than things without having to deny the existence of things. Okay, so there's a range of different interpretations of that position. The view that I think is kind of interesting that some of us have been exploring in the context of biology is that many of the entities that we have traditionally thought were things or construed as things are actually better construed as processes. When I say better, I mean that there's a greater amount of empirical evidence to support the idea that these entities are most accurately construed as processes rather than things. And most conspicuous obvious example would be something like an organism. Right, so traditionally organisms have been sort of paradigmatic examples of substances, which is the sort of the other technical metaphysical term to refer to the contrast class to things, sorry, to processes. But if you just open any biology textbook, it's likely that one of the first things you're going to learn about how organisms maintain themselves is that they are metabolic systems, which are constantly turning over their entire material constitution, and that they need to do that to stay alive. So even something as basic as that already should question that old assumption that the best way to think about metaphysically about the entities that are alive is as substances or things.
When we think about then maybe I look at my computer, look at objects in my environment, so maybe that's fine to say they're things, but then with living organisms there's something fundamentally different in a way, because we are the same form even though our cells are changing. We need to kind of constantly change just to survive.
Yeah. So if people who have been motivated to develop this view in relation to biology specifically will want to make that contrast explicit. But there are people who have defended a process view of nature, and for them, everything is processual, including the computer. If you consider it along a considerably long time scale, then even the computer will eventually fade away. The forces of entropy will do their thing, and you won't end up with anything that looks like the computer as it is today.
Mm-hmm. And then if I look at the stable structure of my computer, how is that explained? Or is it sort of like it's not, the computer is not as fundamental as the processes that can lead to change or
Yeah, I mean, so if you take a thermodynamic perspective, then you could say that machines, including the computer, do not need to exchange matter with their environment, matter and energy with the environment to stay as they are, right? They're close to equilibrium, whereas organisms have to constantly maintain themselves by exchanging matter and energy, which means that that there's a very big difference between a computer and any organism in that respect. So it's not inappropriate to approach a computer by looking at its material constitution, even though, of course, much of what it is able to do is by virtue of programs and electronic circuits, which cannot be completely understood only by looking at the material constitution. Right? There's another level, but there's clearly a big difference between that and say a cell or a cat or a human being.
Tell me more about what weird things we're seeing in biology that's different, that means we might want to radically think about process metaphysics applying to it.
Yeah, so I think that the easiest one to get your head around is metabolic turnover, right? And that has all kinds of interesting implications, that there's no part of you that is as old as you are, because every part of you is undergoing material turnover. And so that has interesting implications for how we think about about our identity over time. But then there are other strong motivations to adopt a process view. One is the fact that organisms develop over time. They undergo massive changes anatomically and physiologically. And so it's very difficult to say what stays the same over time when you look at the life cycle of any organism. We tend to forget that and focus only on the adult version of any kind of organism. But what we need to remember, of course, keep in mind, is that every organism is a four-dimensional sort of space-time worm extended in time, and that any moment in that extended sort of worm that you consider is just a temporal part, just as every spatial part is also a part, right? So if you take that idea seriously, then you can see why it kind of makes sense to think about organisms as processes. Basically, that the processual view cannot deny the importance of time, right? That you can't just abstract time away from your explanations in the way that you can potentially do if you consider the entity as being relatively stable or inert.
Yeah, from your work that we are this intertemporal being, so you don't need to necessarily just look at the organism there spatially in front of you, but I've been talking about it with friends, and then it seems a bit like, okay, I guess that kind of makes sense, but it's a bit weird. Like, surely you should say like the thing in front of you is the organism. But then there's like, reading your work, it's kind of fascinating, people thinking about evolution and the ways in which, since I'm not just me, my fully formed, maybe more adult version now, I mean, if anything were to disrupt sort of my development, or even the development of my parents, there's so many actually factors that contribute to what you see here. And so there was these views that maybe actually it's the life cycle itself, the transition from whatever egg and zygote, or whatever organism you look at, is actually the unit of evolution, not
Yeah.
any one like genes or just the static organism you see.
Yeah, any instantiation of you as you exist over time is not the whole of you. Right? And I think it's a very interesting perspective to have, and it has implications beyond just what we can learn biologically. But yeah, that's the idea. It also serves as a reminder that we are much less insulated from our environment than we may otherwise think. When you think about any object, like a book, you can sort of understand where the boundaries of the book are, where the book ends and the rest of the world begins, as it were. But if it really is the case that organisms are more like flows, they're dynamic fundamentally, then it's a bit like picking out waves in an ocean. I mean, you can pick them out, but it's not always obvious where the wave begins and where it ends. Or think of some sort of atmospheric phenomenon, gust of wind. I mean, these are things that we can say exist, but are not necessarily clear about where to pinpoint the beginning and end. And maybe it's just not a useful question. I mean, John Dupre, who's someone who I've worked with closely on this project, like to mention things like the Mississippi River, where it begins and where it ends, and all these conventions that allow us to decide, that basically we use to decide to where some phenomenon begins and where it ends. But these are just conventions, right? So if we're aware of that, then I think that can have implications for debates about taxonomy and classification and questions about boundaries between objects. Yeah.
Would you say related to this is a quote I found from your book about how perhaps symbiosis in biology is more the rule than the exception? Like in biology as well, you can draw the boundary between the organism, like the kind of more standard, human, whatever that is here in front of you. But then the bacteria within and around us, and the different components like of our environment and other organisms, and also like non-living things that we rely on. And so, you take any one component away, and then I cease to be what I am. And so, if we're going to draw boundaries about where is the organism and where isn't it, it's some ways arbitrary, or depends on the purpose by which we're making that boundary.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, and that was one very important motivation for us to try to take into account this very exciting work that has been done to show how fundamentally interwebbed and interconnected organisms are by virtue of these symbiotic relationships. Yeah, and that it's not just an option. I mean, these are necessary connections, right? You can't. We couldn't survive without the range of other organisms that exist as part of us. So there's even a term that has been coined to refer to this, the holobiont idea, which is that we are basically assemblies, communities of many different kinds of species of organisms that collectively work, and that it's been a mistake to only focus on the cells that are genetically right more associated with what we would think about as a human being, right? But we couldn't digest our food with many of the bacteria that are part of us, and it's very difficult to say those boundaries that then also become blurry.
Yeah. I wonder what a human is when we think in this framework. And again, maybe it's hard to draw strict definitions, but I'm curious, how do we think about even what makes us fundamentally unique as a species? If, maybe we like to draw like a classification, like we have this or that difference with other species, but then if we're very interconnected with others, or like it's just more broadly, there's this problem of it's hard even the concept of species can get blurry, because where is the unit of selection acting upon if there's such an intertwining of different species, each relying on one another? Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, I mean, most of the worries that have been expressed about the species concept have more to do with the idea that there is something as an essence or a kind that we can point in nature and say, well, all of the members of that kind are members of that species. So that's a very old sort of view that goes back to antiquity, and good empirical reasons to say that this is the wrong view. So one of the things that we can say that Darwin's theory does or did is to show that um, the diversity that we see in the world is not just the members of pre-existing types, right? But that there's been an evolution, and different kinds of organisms have evolved by branching out from previous lineages, and the boundaries again between those lineages are going to be blurry. Very difficult to say where, when you look at a tree, very difficult to say where at what point you say this is already a different lineage. And it also has implications for how we consider the meaning of what it means to be a member of a species, right? So if it really is the case that it's a historical process, then there was never one exemplar that gave rise to a particular species, and which you would find maybe in a sort of a biblical account, right? Because if you have that in your head, then it kind of makes sense to say, well, there are these conditions that have to be met, and if they're met, and only those are met, then you have a member of that species. But if it is the case instead that you've always had a population of variable individuals, and they're all a little bit different from one another, then there was never one cat to begin with to allow you to say this is what it means to be a cat. There was always variation, and if there's always variation, then it's very difficult to say again, like what constitutes the conditions of membership for a species. So that's why for quite a few decades now, philosophers of biology and evolutionary biologists have been quite keen to sort of put that to one side, the idea of essentialism, and say, well, we need a different way of thinking about organizing the diversity that we see in the living world. It has to be based instead on recognizing the historical dimension, historical character of life, and that and that we should not think of species as these fundamental fixed things, right?
So I suppose there you're stripping away some Platonic form of there is, cat-ness, or each species of cat, because that's an abstraction, perhaps you'd say. There's only actually individual cat, and I suppose every individual cat, what have you, has different DNA from others, and just the way it's developed, like it's all how can you compare any one individual in a species to another?
Yeah,
So
that's it. Yeah, no two cats are exactly the same, not just by virtue of their genetics, but by virtue of a bunch of different other things. And so it's just a non-starter because, well, how it seems arbitrary already to want to say to want to identify properties of cat-ness, say, right? So yeah, that has really interesting implications because we do tend to think um, of sameness as being prior to difference, right? We philosophically, and then the way we intuit the world, we say, well, okay, you got an idea in your head about what it means to be something, and of course, instantiations of that thing may vary, but you always assume that the idea that you have in your head is in some way prior. And what's really cool about the sort of the Darwinian picture is that it kind of turns that on its head, and it says, well, yes, we may have that concept, but it's something that you develop in your mind after having observed that variation. That the variation is primary. That's what really is basic and elemental. And what is a product or an artifact is your need to make sense and find order by coming up with these concepts that we then reify and tell ourselves stories and myths about how there were these essences that preceded the variation in the world, right? So there's a very nice way of understanding how we've ended up with Platonism by thinking about the Darwinian pictures being prior to it.
I believe an implication of thinking like this from your work or authors you've sort of worked with is that when we think of a species going back in time, say all the different individual organisms of that species, like its lineage, that so we're saying maybe that there is no Platonic form of the species since every individual is changing, but then in some way, if I get this correct, the past lineage is itself an individual, like some kind of, I don't know, meta individual, like
Yeah,
because
that was the proposal that was made in the 70s by David Hull and Mike Gieseling, so two biologists and philosopher of biology, basically making the case that the way to solve this, what is called the species problem, knowing how to, deciding what we call a species, is to treat them not as classes of a logician's kind, right, or sets, but rather as individuals. Why individuals? Because they're historical. They're particulars. There's nothing about them that is necessary, and and so if you think, and that is much more consistent with an evolutionary picture. Now, I think that the choice of the word individual was, I think, a little bit unfortunate because we don't tend to think of populations and lineages as individuals. I think that the word population, understood biologically, would be a more appropriate term. Because the biologist understands a population not just as a bunch of entities that you can classify as part of a set, but as a group of unique individuals, right? And that is what a species ultimately is. I mean, in itself, of course, it's a lineage, and so it is also contingent. But I think that the choice of the word individual, which is the term that has come to be known, by the species as individuals thesis, which is what you were describing, has put some biologists off because it seemed counterintuitive with the word individual.
it is counterintuitive, but in its almost weirdness, I kind of gave me insights. I'm like, okay, I see what you mean. The whole past history of humanity is kind of an individual in the sense that you could see the whole picture of it as like, you don't get where we are now based, unless every individual organism of the larger organism of humanity, um, yeah, it's all organisms existed as part of that, even if I guess some died out, but that's still part of the variation of
I think the important class that is the contrast that is being made there is between individual and class, right? A class as in a logical set, where you have these characteristics that determine membership in that class. That's what is being rejected with this picture. Think of and maybe a way of making it more intuitive is thinking about something like the Roman Empire. Roman Empire was an individual of some kind, right? Obviously made up of lots of different entities, but that's different from talking about the atomic number of carbon that determines why a particular atom is a carbon atom, right? And that seems to be
Mm.
the contrast there, right? Where the chemist may be quite happy to say that when you look at the periodic table, those are describing sort of natural kinds, and that there's nothing contingent about it. I mean, of course, you have isotopes, and maybe at the quantum level, the story gets a bit more complicated. But the classical view is one that perfectly fits with this essentialism that we can trace back to Aristotle and Plato.
Yeah, tell me more about molecules and we go lower down, chemistry, physics. So maybe we're saying there it's okay to think of like classes and Platonic forms, like they're all the same, or iron atoms are basically the same, whereas in biology it's different. A cell, an organism, they're very unique, and there's so many factors that really there's no two identical cells, perhaps you'd say.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a very interesting proposition, and maybe one way to think about the difference between biology and the human sciences ultimately, and the physical sciences. That in the physical sciences, this kind of thinking fits quite well. This kind of essentialism does not lead you astray, and it seems to be a reasonable working hypothesis. And that, yes, of course, there's variation in the physical world, but that variation can be sort of dismissed as some sort of there's noise or some sort of deviation, accidental differences, whereas this really is a problem in biology, right? To assume that when you're looking at a population of anything, of frogs or anything, and to assume that the what's in the middle of your curve, what's at the top, what is reflects the pure, the true value, and that everything that deviates from that norm is just deviation. I think that is what needs to be identified as problematic, because that variation is fundamental. So that's what the Darwinian picture is sort of requiring us to take seriously, that we should not reduce the complexity of any group of individuals to some norm or some type that you can get at through statistics.
Mm.
You know?
If we look at, say, two atoms, yeah, would there be variation? I mean, I suppose like they have electron clouds and there are differences, but then just on average, and any one atom interacts very similarly with all the other chemicals, and it's maybe more easy to draw laws. Like this is just how this kind of atom interacts. Whereas in biology, maybe like you say, oh, this is what this kind of cell does, or how this kind of cell interacts with this kind of poison or food. But actually, depending on the gene expression, perhaps, or the history of that cell, would you say that's like maybe it's much more difficult to make similar
Yeah,
comparisons?
I think that many. Well, look, we should say that don't think maybe we can't do science if we only recognize that everything is fundamentally unique. So I think that is something we need to address. It's not a satisfying conclusion to arrive at and say, we can stop this because of the scientific enterprise seems to require us, or is normally based on the assumption that we arrive at insight through generalizations, and presumably you may not be able to do many generalizations if the entities that you're looking at are different. So that could be one simple way of brushing aside this and saying, well, yeah, okay, in some trivial way, everything is a bit different from everything else, but it doesn't really matter to what you want to explain, because we care about regularities and things like that. But I think even that could be challenged. And just to return to the point about atoms, many theories of physics actually presuppose that the entities that are to which they apply can be substituted for one another without any problem. So when you think about an ensemble of gas particles in statistical mechanics, it really doesn't matter which gas. All the gas particles are equivalent to every other. Everyone can stand for any other, right? So the theories, even if in reality there may be differences, the theories and the fact that these theories has been successful has been by virtue of the fact that they have abstracted away any any differences if they do exist, right? Same thing with thinking about electrons in a quantum mechanical perspective, or even thinking about matter in Newtonian mechanics. I mean, we do recognize difference in position and momentum, but for all intents and purposes, every chunk of matter is kind of uh, equivalent. We don't make differences. We care about the mass, and we can quantify it, but we don't consider any qualitative differences, right? Whereas in biology, that doesn't seem to work very well. Another way to put this is like that once you've seen an electron, you've seen them all, as far as the models of physics are concerned, or a copper atom or whatever. But if you've seen a tiger, you haven't seen all tigers, or a daffodil or something, right? There's something interesting about the fact that there's difference between members of a population. And so this raises all kinds of interesting questions about how we should do science, right? We use statistics normally to handle large numbers, but often in statistics, what we end up doing is relying on measures that obscure those differences, right? The mean, mode, median. These are all measures that allow us to handle a population as if it was a unit, when maybe metaphysically speaking, what we should do is never forget that we're never dealing with a unit. We're always dealing with a population.
Yeah, I do more psychology and economics, and sometimes that framework of only looking at averages and whole populations means you sometimes don't get satisfying answers of, okay, but how did any one individual actually interpret the situation they were in, and the average response is kind of no one's response in a way.
Right.
And
When the average human being has one testicle and one mammary gland, right?
yeah,
The average doesn't reflect anyone in the in the population. Exactly. Yeah. And we know, I mean, from our everyday experience, that no two individuals are the same. Like, you don't have to convince anyone that you and your sibling are different, or and people who have pets or who have dogs and cats will be able to tell you that no two cats are the same or no two dogs are the same. And shepherds will be able to tell apart their sheep in a herd, and horticulturists will be able to identify different flowers, and plants and everything. So it seems like our experience of the world is telling us that you got variation everywhere, and yet the requirements of doing science are pushing us in a totally different direction. It's a very interesting tension there between the two.
I wonder what science kind of looks like then, if there's a way that, how do we get, is science necessarily composed of stable facts that are, like this is something that like is mostly true across a lot of people? What I just wonder what scientific theories look like if they are to engage with the uniqueness of any one
Well, you could
individual.
say that, something like geology, that studies the formation of the Earth, is a science with a sample size of one.
Mm.
And so you got some sciences where you're looking at what's happened in the history of the Earth, and the Earth specifically. Then that is an example of an enterprise that is concerned only with one entity. I mean, you could even say that this is now pushing it a bit, but you could say that because life, as far as we know, has only evolved on this planet, that biology is also a science that deals with sample size of one, because all life comes from one. I mean, I think that's not quite convincing, I think, to anyone. But you could make, but people
Yeah.
who are interested in the search for extraterrestrial life tend to say exactly that. That how can we ever have a universal science of biology just so we have a universal science of physics, where we know that what we say about the characteristics of a metal are going to apply anywhere in the universe, if our only sample of life that we have to work with is the contingent one that happened to evolve on this planet and nowhere else. I mean, surely there are going to be things that are peculiar to this planet, and there are going to be things that are not, and there's no way for us to tell them apart if we only have one sample.
Right. And there is a way in which there are stable patterns of biology, like perhaps patterns in how species, even though it's a tricky concept, form and operate, and I still wonder, we kind of get rid of the Platonic form possibility, but then in biology, it's less clear that the stable structure compared to, say, physics, but there is. And so I guess that the thing you said there kind of made me think there's a kind of path dependency. If certain things were different earlier on, it's not that the laws of physics would be different. Like, it would still be kind of same forces at play. It's just, if one thing comes before the other, then maybe you get very different species. And I suppose that has happened in the history of Earth. You have some kind of species, and then they die off, and you get sometimes bizarre, different looking species, and it's very hard to say why necessarily one species versus the other than like the specific context, like environment around which new species were in. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some people have used this strong contingency that you have where things could have easily been different to formulate an argument against the existence of laws of biology, like distinctively biological laws. They can't, according to this view, there can't be real laws of biology because everything that you see in the living world is a contingent outcome of evolution that could have been different. And laws are supposed to identify necessities, natural necessities, things that are robust, and there can't be much that is robust at the biological level. And anything that looks like a law, it's either really a contingent distribution that could be different, or it's a chemical or physical law in disguise. So if you say, well, yeah, but you have the same kind of chemistry in the same biochemistry. You've got the Krebs cycle. You've got one may want to say, this is not necessarily my view, by the way, but this is very, very sort of really popular, I would say, dominant view in my field. That that is what makes biology different. That it doesn't have laws because of this contingency, and so that goes in hand with what we were talking about before about the uniqueness of the biological world. I don't think necessarily that those two. I don't think that they imply one another, but if you have one view, then the other sits quite comfortably alongside it.
I wonder as well with biology about the agency and choice, free will, perhaps, that we organisms have. Also, well, I don't know exactly where agency is or isn't, but especially wherever there is agency, now, even if there were past forces of evolution, there may be a possibility to change from what came before. And I'm just wondering, kind of, in tandem with what you're saying there, how much you can say that the unique action someone takes under free will actually was determined by the past. But also, again, it's still a weird concept because you're like, okay, but if it wasn't all based on the past, like where did it come from? Like where are we justified to say there really is agency, there really is free will? But also there is something unique. Yeah, I mean, like what I'm trying to get at is we talked about the uniqueness of biology, right? No laws. Is it a more complicated factor when we get to agency, when we get to intelligence? And does that defy yet further laws, or are agency and intelligence law-like, and we can kind of understand them?
I mean, there's been a reawakening in my field of interest in the question of agency. Actually, in the last 10 years or so, or even 5 years, because it's become apparent to many people that you can't really have a theory of the organism, of what organisms are like, if you don't endow them with agency. And I've noticed you were talking about agency and free will, or agency and intelligence. I think an important step here is to actually distinguish these, and not to assume that just because you're an agent that is assuming that you are also, that you have free will, or that you are intelligent or anything like that, because that would be clear sort of anthropomorphic projection. But that if we understand agency very minimally as the ability to act, right, to interact with your surroundings, to engage in the world, then one can develop a theory of agency, at least in principle, that allows you to understand why to be alive is to be an agent, because as a living being you have to do things to stay in existence, because if you stop doing what you do, then you're no longer existing. That's part of the sort of the metabolic imperative, which of course is very processual, right? Just as if you are a whirlpool or something, or a flame, there are certain things that you need to do, that needs to do. Need is of course a word that's maybe a bit loaded, but you see what I'm saying, right? That if it doesn't do what it's doing at the moment, it will no longer be what it is, as opposed to your computer, where you can turn it off tonight, and in the safe assumption that tomorrow morning when you go back to it, it will still be there, and it won't have disappeared or disintegrated as a consequence of not being active or on. So, in this new interest in the notion of agency, there's been a lot of discussion about how we should think about this concept. And to me, having done so much work trying to show the inadequacy of machine metaphors and machine models, and as a way of understanding what organisms are, it fits quite nicely, because I think that one of the reasons why we don't have a theory of agency is because we have been so dominated by this conception of the organism as a machine, because machines don't have agency. Machines are instruments. Machines don't have their own goals. They fulfill the goals of the creator, designer, or user, or whatever, right? So in that sense, you could argue that giving up that machine view and adopting a more processual view, like we've been talking about, is one step towards the recognition that we are dealing with entities that are different from these mechanical systems, that are different from computers. And one of those differences is that they exhibit that capacity to act, not just to react, but to act on their own behalf in a directed way. And that this has to be part of our theory. I mean, for many people, this is almost considered non-scientific, to want to say that an organism is an agent. But if you stop anybody in the street and you ask them, hey, tell me what constitutes, what makes an organism, and they will probably say something like, well, they do things, cats chase birds, and it's all about activity, right? And so it's kind of interesting that the folk view of what life is completely drenched in language of agency, and yet the scientific understanding of life is not. And there's almost an embarrassment about it, that we shouldn't do that because it won't be taken seriously by the physicists, and we're not going to get, we're not going to provide objective knowledge of the biological world if we infuse it with this language. So that's but the fact that we're having that conversation is already very good news, because it shows that there is an appetite. Before, that would have just been a non-starter, So now there's a bit of an appetite even among scientists to think about this.
Right, and process philosophy seems very helpful here, because sometimes you might think, agency and self-movement from the organism, well, that seems like we're not explaining anything there. We need to say what are the mechanisms by which the organism, appears to have agency, perhaps. But if there is some movement and change bound up in the organism, maybe not anything couldn't be unless it was sort of a process anyway, and so that it's gonna have agency to navigate that change, to do things, chase birds as a cat, to maintain itself as a cat. We kind of should expect that.
Exactly. I mean, that key point is that you end up expecting it. I mean, that's the incredible sort of dramatic consequence of making this turn, is that not only is it no longer something really strange, but that it's something that you should expect to find in the first place. It should be strange if it's not there, if it's strange if it's not part of your theory to recognize that agency, if you start with those assumptions, with the processual assumptions. Exactly right. So I think this is a real testament to how important metaphysical assumptions are in science. Scientists tend to have a very bleak view, and don't want to of metaphysics, and even some philosophers of science, due to the particular history of the field, where the field emerged by a bunch of people, the Vienna Circle, who thought that the only way to make progress in philosophy was to eliminate all metaphysics. But the reality is that you can't have a picture of the world of any kind without some metaphysical assumption underlying it. All of science has it, and that we need to make those explicit, because really, um, they're there anyway, right? And so what are you assuming to be true when you do science and when you interpret data in a particular way? If you take a different assumption, a different framework, like a processual framework, what becomes the thing that you need to explain? Or if you assume that everything is fundamentally unique, then what becomes the thing that you need to explain? Well, maybe what you need to explain is why things look the same. Why is it that essentialism as an idea has been as successful or as useful as it has been historically? If it really is the case that reality is made up of unique individualities, right? So it totally changes what you want to explain. If you're a physiologist, you know that the system is constantly having to maintain a sort of a homeostasis, then what you need to explain is not you can take that for granted, right? You can assume that chain, that dynamic stability, is what allows the organism to be what it is, right?
I liked how in your process biology book there was a chapter by someone on cancer, and thinking then applying this framework to helpfully see disease in a new light, and then that kind of argued that cancer, it's not really like something that happens to a stable organism, but that the organism is actually a process continually evading and pushing away cancer. It's
Yes,
completely the opposite, but it's
totally
very
different.
helpful.
Yeah. It is very interesting. Yeah, it's like the question then becomes not why cancer happens, but why does it not happen as often as it, why doesn't it not happen more often than it does, given the dynamic sort of condition where all these cells in your body happen to find themselves in. Yeah.
Yeah, what is what is the most important thing that process philosophy does? And you kind of talked about it, but is there any specific area that you're like, this is a problem we could really help sort of resolve?
I don't think this is no single example comes to mind. I think it depending on what you're interested in, it can help you, right? So I think what you mentioned now about disease. I mean, it really gives you a totally different perspective on thinking about what diseases even are. Like you have that historically influential view of disease as being something that comes from the outside. That there's some sort of pathogen that is responsible for whatever condition you develop. Whereas the processual view suggests a very different, doesn't need to be mutually exclusive, but an alternative way of thinking about pathology as as a processual system not being able to maintain its dynamic state in an optimal way. What happens when those systems of control and regulation fail, right? That's a very different picture of what it means to have.
Yeah. What are you working on at the moment? What interests you?
Well, I mean, I just published a very long study of what is known as population thinking, which is this idea of it's this assumption that everything in the biological world is fundamentally unique. And so this is one of the reasons why it came up in this conversation, is because it's kind of at the the front of my mind at the moment, because this is a bit like the processual view. It's like an alternative way of thinking about reality, not the dominant way, and yet one that can actually help you think about things in a totally different way. So that to me is kind of exciting. I'm excited by the fact that you see that uniqueness at all levels. It's not just the level of species at higher taxa, not just at the level of organisms, but also going down to the level of cells, and even proteins and DNA. Even almost at the forefront of the interface between chemistry and biology, you still find much individuality. Where you molecular biologists are discovering that no two proteins of the same kind do the same thing when they function. They don't have one function, and so we are confronted with those questions, empirically speaking, that are challenging those assumptions about sameness and types and essences, right? So I think it's a very, very interesting new perspective to take, and there's sort of an appetite for it. So there's in many areas like ecologists and people who study entomologists and physiologists are all sort of recently in the last 10 or 15 years have been crying out, or at least denouncing the problems that emerge when, as you said, we take the mean or as representative of the population. Some scientists are calling it the tyranny of the golden mean. Like we are under this constant assumption that any variation that you find when you're looking at a population is either a product of experimental error, so it's not even there because it's measurement error, or if it's there, it's not relevant. It's like an accident. And so it's kind of been interesting to me to find that there are these voices that are emerging in different areas of biology, looking at very different kinds of phenomena, all saying, hey, there's like a hidden world beneath population averages that we should start exploring. We should just not rest content with the appeal to statistical measures that are sort of reducing that variation. Mm. And it's not easy to understand. I mean, it has, as with the process perspective, it has disquieting and disturbing implications. Like we talked about briefly, like how can you do science if it really is the case that you're dealing with individuals which are unique? How do you is it really the case that science is concerned with simplifying and identifying regularities? What kind of science can we hope for if we're dealing with a domain of phenomena that is fundamentally different? I mean, in the human sciences, I guess in economics, you can tell me. I mean, there's this tension that we know that every human is different, and yet we tend to treat groups as entities in their own right, where we're completely forgetting or dismissing the uniqueness of individuals. And maybe in those models, one can say, yeah, we don't have to worry about that. It's not important for what we want to explain. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, there are people thinking about relational science, right? And like how we can still have stable concepts, even though, it's not necessarily just the average. One interesting thinker I like, who published a paper with Michael Levin, actually, is kind of actually using economics to help us understand some of the individuality of the world, by thinking about actually the way in which, say, economic principles help in a multicellular organism. So, it's okay if any individual cell or proteins do different things, because there's kind of coordinating mechanisms so that each part in its individual place actually can still kind of navigate, trade almost with this other partners. And so it's okay. There are kind of laws, but there may be a more high level economic. You kind of have to assume agency and these sort of that person's Benjamin Lyons, and I'll put him in the description. He's really good. So yeah,
exactly. I mean, there's an old idea going back to the 19th century that what statistical treatments precisely allow you to do is to identify new patterns in the disorder and in the messiness. You can find regularities, and that actually requires you to not look at individuals as individuals, right? I mean, if you think about how statistical mechanics understands the properties of gases, it's not by understanding what each gas molecule is doing. It's by deliberately choosing not to think about these billions of constituent particles and saying, well, what can we say about it as an ensemble, as an entity in its own right? And so, I think that is I think recognized, and I'm sure in economics there must be, and in social science, similar examples of how useful it can be to not think about all the complexities of individuals and instead focus on what is likely to happen at the populational level. And it's of course very almost paradoxical that we can gain insight about a group of really complex entities better than we can gain insight about the individuals that make up those groups, because you would think that the group is even more complex than the each individual, and yet much of the use of statistics is predicated on that notion that we can gain insight precisely by taking larger numbers into
Mm.
consideration. Yeah.
I mean, I think it would be cool to be better informed in science about how entities merge together or dissociate, like whether that's in biology, organisms form collectives or not, or economics. It's kind of typical, when is the decision to be an individual agent or do you form a firm, or it depends on the model, but that would be cool because again, like it's also there can be assumptions about metaphysical scientific assumptions when you say, oh, that's the agent, the thing we care about, and like they're the things interacting. It's like, yeah, potentially, but sometimes that to what the agent is can itself change, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So any way you want to point people as we finish this off? This has been really fun.
Oh, well, no, I mean, I'm delighted that there's interest in these ideas beyond the original space to which they were targeted. So it's really interesting to hear that maybe some of these processual views can be of use in areas like economics. I mean, that's kind of exciting. So I'm looking forward
Yeah,
to learn more about that.
your book has been really exciting. Yeah, the range of different areas this kind of thinking applies to. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's an edited volume, and we had a great number of really smart people contributing from many different perspectives. So I think that's a testament to all the people that were part of that project. And the idea was just to start the conversation. I think it's succeeded in doing that, and it's been interesting to see how those ideas have been taken up in different contexts. So yeah, looking forward to seeing what happens with this processual approach.
Mm. Yeah, that book is Everything Flows.
Yeah,
What's it called? Yeah.
everything goes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's actually open access. So John, my co-editor, was able to pay the fee to have it published open access with Oxford University Press. So it's freely down. You can download it for free from the web page of the publisher, which is kind of nice. Yeah.
Mm. Yes, it was nice for me. Thank you.
Of course.
Awesome. See you.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you. Okay.